The gun was pressed against the side of Wesley Haskins's head when Louisa Archer asked him the question that changed everything. It was not the cold steel at his temple that broke him open. It was not the way his knees were grinding into the dry Arizona dirt, or the blood tracking a slow line down his jaw from where Earl Cutter had pistol-whipped him twice already. It was not even the knowledge, sitting heavy as a stone in his chest, that Cutter's men had the entire ranch surrounded and that the nearest lawman was 40 miles away in Tucson. No. What cracked Wesley Haskins wide open after 11 years of keeping himself sealed shut was the woman kneeling in the dirt beside him, her wrists bound behind her back, her dark hair loose and wild around her face, asking him the one thing nobody had ever thought to ask. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" Her voice was quiet. Impossibly, absurdly quiet given that Earl Cutter was standing over them both with a revolver and a smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever. Her brown eyes found his across the narrow distance between them, and they were steady. Afraid, yes. The fear was there if you looked closely enough, trembling at the edges of her composure, but the question was real. She genuinely wanted to know. Wesley stared at her. Dust coated her blue traveling dress, and there was a cut on her cheekbone she had not had 2 hours ago, and she was asking him about loneliness. He should have said no. That was the answer he had been giving the whole world for 11 years. He had built his entire life on that answer. The cattle, the ranch, the solitary rides through country so empty it made other men weep. He had built walls of silence and distance and work, and the answer had always been no. No, he was fine. No, he did not need anyone. No, the quiet did not bother him. "Yes," Wesley said, and the word came out of him like something that had been lodged behind his ribs for years. "Yes, I get lonely out here every single day." Louisa Archer held his gaze and said, "Then we are going to survive this, Wesley Haskins, and after we do, you are going to tell me all about it." Earl Cutter laughed and told them both to shut their mouths, but the thing had already been said. The admission, raw and unexpected as a lightning strike in a clear sky, had already burned its way into the world between them, and nothing that came after would ever fully erase it. This was how it had started. Not here, not with guns and dirt and blood. It had started 6 weeks earlier. On the morning the stagecoach from Tucson rattled down the main road past the Haskins ranch, carrying a woman with a carpet bag, a letter of introduction, and the kind of stubborn courage that Wesley would spend the rest of his life admiring. The year was 1878, and the territory of Arizona was not yet a state and would not become one for 34 more years. Wesley Haskins had owned his 300 acres since 1871, when he was 22 years old and fresh out of a war that had already taken everything that had made him soft. He had driven cattle up from Texas with a crew of 6, settled on land near the Santa Cruz River where the grass ran green in spring and the mountains turned purple at dusk, and he had built himself a life that was productive, organized, solitary, and as emotionally barren as the surrounding desert. He had a foreman named Hector Reyes, who was 40 years old and had a family in Nogales he saw on Sundays when the work allowed. He had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Tom and Dale Briggs, who were good workers and kept to themselves. He had a dog named General who was getting old and slept most of the time. He had 700 head of cattle, 2 horses he was particularly fond of, a well-built adobe and timber house with 4 rooms, and absolutely nobody to share any of it with. He was 29 years old. He had not been to a social gathering, a dance, a church service, or a dinner that was not a business transaction in 3 years. He had not had a conversation longer than practical necessity required in longer than that. He had told himself, every morning when the silence woke him before dawn, that this was exactly what he wanted. The war had taught him that wanting things was how you lost them. Attachment was how people died. Caring about a place, a person, a future was how you invited the universe to destroy it. So Wesley Haskins had deliberately cared about nothing. He was expert at it. He did not see Louisa Archer arrive. He was out on the east pasture checking the fence line when the stagecoach passed, and when he returned at midday, he found Hector standing on the porch of the main house looking slightly confused, and a woman sitting in the wooden chair by the front door with her carpet bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap with the kind of deliberate patience that suggested she had been waiting for some time. Wesley pulled his horse up short and looked at her. She looked back at him without flinching, which was the first thing he noticed. Most people, when confronted with Wesley Haskins after a long morning in the sun, with dust on his clothes and a look on his face that his mother had once described as a thundercloud waiting for permission to storm, found something else to look at. This woman looked straight at him. "Mr. Haskins," she said, and stood up. She was perhaps 5'4", with dark brown hair pinned up under a sensible hat, brown eyes that caught the light in a way that was immediately inconvenient, and a bearing that was composed without being cold. "My name is Louisa Archer. I believe you are expecting me." Wesley was absolutely not expecting her. He looked at Hector. Hector produced an envelope from his back pocket with the expression of a man who has been holding something awkward for several hours. "Came with the Morning Post 3 weeks ago," Hector said. "You were in Tucson. I put it on the desk. I may have forgot to mention it." Wesley took the envelope. The letter inside was from his sister Clara, who lived in St. Louis and had appointed herself the manager of his life from a comfortable distance. The letter explained that Clara had met a woman named Louisa Archer, a schoolteacher from Missouri whose family had died during a flooding event the previous winter, and who was seeking a position in the West where her skills might be useful. Clara had written that the new schoolhouse in the town of Crane's Crossing, 12 miles away, was in need of a teacher, and that she had written to the schoolhouse board on Louisa's behalf, and they had agreed to the position, and that since Wesley lived in the most logical stopping point between Crane's Crossing and Tucson, and since his ranch was the only respectable and safe establishment for that section of road, he would of course be happy to provide Miss Archer lodging for a night or two until she got her bearings. Clara had not asked. Clara never asked. Clara simply arranged things. "I apologize for any inconvenience," Louisa Archer said, watching his face with those inconvenient eyes. "I understand your sister may have overstepped. If this is not a good time, I can make arrangements to continue to town." "How?" Wesley said. The stagecoach had already gone. Louisa glanced down the road where the dust of its passing was still settling. "I can walk." "It's 12 miles, Wesley said. "The road runs through the Cutter property for 4 miles of it." He watched her absorb that information. He watched her decide not to ask what was wrong with the Cutter property. She had good instincts. "Then I appreciate the lodging," she said, "if the offer still stands." It had not precisely been offered, but Wesley Haskins, for reasons he could not explain and did not try to, said that it did. He showed her to the spare room, which had not been used in 2 years, and smelled of it. He brought water for the basin. He told her supper was at 6 and the privy was behind the house, and he left quickly because being in an enclosed space with her directness was like standing too close to a fire after spending a long time in the cold. He was not sure if he liked the warmth or feared it. Supper was cornbread, beans, and salt pork, the same as every other night, because Wesley had never seen a reason to cook differently for one person than for no person. He expected her to make some comment about it. She did not. She ate, complimented the cornbread, which was the only part of the meal that had any real merit, and asked him about the ranch. He told her about the cattle. He told her about the fencing problem on the east pasture. He told her about the water situation near the dry creek bed. These were things he could talk about indefinitely, because they were practical and did not require him to say anything real. She listened to all of it. She did not interrupt, or look bored, or try to redirect him to something she found more interesting. She listened the way people listened when they actually cared about understanding something, and Wesley found this deeply unsettling. "Your sister says you served in the war," she said when there was a pause. "A lot of men did," Wesley said. She says you were at Shiloh and Chickamauga, Louisa said. A lot of men were, Wesley said. She looked at him for a moment. I am not going to ask about it, she said. I only mention it because my father served too, and I know that sometimes people bring it up because they expect you to justify the choices you made when you were 20 years old, and I have no interest in doing that. Wesley set down his fork. He looked at her. He was not sure what to say because nobody had ever said that to him before. He had spent years braced for questions about the war, ready with the non-answers he kept loaded for that purpose, and she had just taken away the target. Thank you, he said, which was also something he did not say very often. She nodded and asked him about the mountains to the west. He told her about them. They talked until the candle burned low, which was later than Wesley had stayed at the table in years. She was supposed to stay 2 days. She stayed a week, because the schoolhouse board wrote that the schoolhouse itself was not yet finished and would not be ready for another 6 days. Wesley told her to stay as long as she needed, using the flat, practical tone he used for business matters, and he did not examine why he felt, underneath that flatness, something uncomfortably close to relief. She was unlike anyone he had encountered in Arizona. She was educated, genuinely and substantially so, with opinions on things he had not thought about in years. She had read more books than he had, which was saying something, because Wesley had always been a reader even when there was nothing practical to read. She had opinions about water rights and land management that were not half wrong, having apparently read about irrigation practices while traveling west. She was funny in a dry, understated way that caught him off guard twice before he realized that was simply how she spoke. She was also, and this was the thing that genuinely troubled him, not afraid of the silences. Most people who visited the ranch filled the quiet with chatter. His foreman Hector talked consistently about his family, the weather, and the cattle in that order. The Briggs brothers talked about nothing particularly, just to keep the silence at bay. When Clara had visited 3 years ago, she had filled every moment with plans and suggestions and observations. But Louisa Archer would sit on the porch in the evening after supper and simply be there, looking out at the mountains turning color in the setting sun, not talking, not performing contentment, just existing in the quiet alongside him as if she had done it all her life. It was, Wesley found, the most companionable thing that had happened to him in 11 years. By the 3rd day, he had stopped eating supper as fast as possible and leaving the table. By the 5th day, he was coming back to the ranch at midday, instead of eating cold food on the fence line. By the 7th day, when she mentioned that the schoolhouse would be ready day after tomorrow, he felt a loss so genuine and immediate that it alarmed him considerably. He did not say any of this. He said, "I'll arrange a wagon to take you over." She said that was very kind. She said she had truly appreciated his hospitality and that he had a beautiful ranch and that she hoped the east pasture fence line gave him less trouble. He said he hoped she liked teaching in Crane's Crossing. He said it was a decent town mostly. He said that if she needed anything, Hector could get a message to him. What he did not say was, "Do not go." What he did not say was, "I have not felt like myself in years, and in 7 days you have done something to that, and I am afraid of what it means that you living 12 miles away feels like the same distance as the moon." He drove the wagon himself. He told himself it was because Hector needed to stay with the cattle. This was partially true. The town of Crane's Crossing in 1878 was a real, functioning community of about 300 people, built along the eastern fork of a tributary creek and sustained by cattle ranching, a small mining operation in the hills to the north, a general store, a saloon, a dry goods merchant, a doctor who was also a dentist, a post office, a livery stable, a church, and now a schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was a simple adobe structure with wooden benches and a blackboard that had arrived last month from Tucson. It smelled of fresh plaster and sawdust and possibility. Louisa walked through it with her hand trailing along the wall and a look on her face that Wesley recognized, though it took him a moment to place it. It was the look of a person arriving at something they were meant to do. He met the schoolhouse board, 2 ranchers and the store owner, who asked him too many questions about his cattle, and not enough about whether they were paying the teacher fairly. And he answered politely and kept watching Louisa across the room as she talked with some of the women who had come to see the new schoolteacher. She had set down her carpet bag beside the small desk at the front of the room, and she was laughing at something a woman named Mabel Cook had said, and she looked fully, genuinely happy. Not performing it, happy. He drove home alone. The road felt longer than it had on the way over. He told himself it was over. She was settled. She had her schoolhouse and her purpose, and the women of Crane's Crossing had already claimed her as theirs. He would go back to his ranch and his fence lines and his early mornings, and things would return to exactly what they had been, which was acceptable and organized and sufficient. The next Saturday, he rode into Crane's Crossing for supplies he did not strictly need. He did not go to the schoolhouse. He bought his supplies, talked to the livery owner about a saddle repair, and was genuinely about to leave when he rounded a corner and found Louisa Archer standing in front of the general store holding a large and apparently heavy bag of flour, negotiating with the door handle in a way that was clearly about to result in flour everywhere. He took the bag without being asked. She looked up at him with an expression that suggested she was not entirely surprised to find him there, which was either very perceptive or very lucky. "Thank you," she said. "You saved the floor." "And the flour," he said. "Yes," she said and smiled. He carried the flour to the small room she was renting from the Cook family behind the livery stable, which were clean and serviceable and contained, he noticed, approximately 47 books arranged along every horizontal surface available. He set the flour down and looked at the books and felt the corners of his mouth do something that might have been a smile. "Clara mentioned you were a reader," Louisa said. "Clara mentions a great deal," Wesley said. "She does," Louisa agreed. "She also mentioned that you have not had supper with another human being more than twice in the past year." "That is an exaggeration," Wesley said. "Is it?" He thought about it. "Possibly not a very large one," he admitted. She looked at him with those steady eyes. "The Cook family has supper at 6, she said. "Mabel invited me. I expect there would be room for one more." He said he would think about it. He stayed for supper. That was the 2nd week. The 3rd week he came into town again with slightly better justification, and they walked along the creek in the early evening while the cottonwoods made their quiet sound in the wind off the mountains. She told him about Missouri, about her parents, about the flooding that had taken them in February of 1877. She told it without self-pity, in the clear, factual way she had of talking about hard things, and he listened in the way she had first listened to him, with the whole of his attention. He told her something about the war. Not about the battles, not about the things he had done, but about the day he had come home to Tennessee in 1866 to find his father's farm sold and his father dead and his younger brother gone west, and the way he had stood in the middle of a strange family's field and understood with complete clarity that there was no longer anything left to go back to, and so he had gone forward instead. "That must have been very lonely," she said. "It was," he said, and was surprised to find he could say it that simply. They were standing by the creek when he said it, the water running low and steady over the pale stones, the sun going down in colors behind the mountains that he had been seeing every evening for 7 years and never thought to tell anyone about. He had told her about them once briefly, and she had gone quiet and looked at them the same way he had always looked at them, and something about that had sat in his chest like warmth ever since. "Do you have plans on Sunday?" he asked. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I would like to show you the ranch properly," he said. "The east pasture and the river section. Hector has found a place where the wild horses come in the early morning sometimes." She said she would like that very much. He rode home in the dark and spent 40 minutes examining the ceiling of his bedroom, which he had not done since the first months on the ranch. The wild horses came that Sunday morning, 6 of them moving through the pale golden grass in the early light, their breath making small clouds in the cool air. Wesley watched Louisa watch them from horseback beside him, and the look on her face was the same one she had worn in the schoolhouse on the first day, the look of someone encountering something they were meant to encounter. "That is the most beautiful thing I have seen since I arrived here," she said softly. He looked at her, not at the horses. He said nothing. He was 30 years old and had not held another person's hand in 11 years, and he was having a great deal of difficulty thinking about fence lines. They rode the whole east pasture and then the river section, and he showed her the place where the cottonwoods grew oldest and tallest and made a kind of cathedral with the sky. And she sat on a rock at the river's edge and took off her boots and put her feet in the cold water and laughed at the shock of it. And it was the most alive sound he had heard in a very long time. He sat on the rock beside her, not touching, just there. She asked him how he had chosen this particular piece of land, and he found himself telling her the truth, which was that he had not chosen it so much as recognized it, standing on a slight rise looking out at the mountains and the grass and the water, and understanding that this was the place he was going to build something worth building. "What were you going to build?" she asked. "A cattle operation," he said. "That is not what you were going to build," she said, gently but absolutely. He looked at the river. "No," he said, "it is not." The 4th week he came into town twice. On the 2nd visit, he brought her a book he had thought she might not have, a collection of essays on natural history that she had mentioned in passing, and she received it with an expression of such genuine pleasure that he felt slightly unsteady on his feet for a moment. The 5th week, she rode out to the ranch without an occasion because Tom Briggs was in town and she had borrowed his horse, and the reason she gave was that she wanted to see how the east pasture fence line was coming along, which was such an obvious pretext that they both knew it was a pretext but neither acknowledged the fact. He showed her the fence line. They had lunch under the cottonwoods. They talked for 3 hours about nothing particularly important and everything that mattered. When she was leaving, she turned in the saddle and looked back at him, and there was something in her expression that stopped him cold, something open and clear and dangerously unguarded. "Wesley," she said. "Louisa," he said. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then she turned her horse and rode back toward town, and he stood in the yard watching her go, knowing with complete certainty that he was already in this thing past the point of safe retreat, and not being sure, for the first time in 11 years, whether he minded. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, with the subtlety and timing of a rock through a window. His name was Earl Cutter, and he had been a fixture of the region since before Wesley had arrived, which meant he had built his position through a combination of early land acquisition, selective violence, and the kind of political connections that flourished in territories not yet governed by reliable law. Cutter owned the 4 miles of road between the Haskins Ranch and Crane's Crossing. More specifically, he owned the land on both sides of it, which in practice meant that anyone traveling it did so at his discretion and his mood. Wesley had maintained a careful, deliberate distance from Earl Cutter for 7 years, based on the assessment that Cutter was the kind of man who expanded when given space to expand, and was best kept from expansion by being given no opportunities. This strategy had worked, because Wesley had nothing Cutter particularly wanted, and gave him no reason to develop an interest. That calculation changed when Cutter began buying up water rights along the Santa Cruz tributary. If Cutter gained control of the creek section that ran along the eastern edge of the Haskins property, he could legally restrict Wesley's access to the primary water supply for the eastern pastures, which would make 400 acres functionally useless and reduce the value of the entire ranch by more than half. This was not an accident. Cutter was doing it deliberately and methodically, and Wesley knew it, and Hector knew it, and the 2 men who held the remaining water rights between Cutter's current holdings and the critical creek section knew it, which was why both of them had sold quietly in the past 2 months. Wesley had gone to Tucson and consulted a lawyer who told him that if he could get the territorial legislature to consider a water rights protection measure, he might have a case, but that in the short term his best option was to file a preemptive claim on the creek section himself and be prepared to defend it. He had filed the claim and returned home. What he had not anticipated was that Cutter would discover his connection to Louisa Archer. Cutter's man came to the ranch on a Monday evening, a lean man named Garrett who had the look of someone who delivered messages he enjoyed delivering. He sat on the porch where Louisa had sat on the first day, 6 weeks ago, and told Wesley that Mr. Cutter was aware of his interest in the creek section, and that Mr. Cutter was also aware of his friendship with the new schoolteacher, and that Mr. Cutter was a man who appreciated the importance of social connections. Wesley stood in the yard and looked at Garrett without expression. "What does Cutter want?" he said. "He wants the creek section," Garrett said. "He's offering fair payment." "I filed a preemptive claim," Wesley said. "He's aware," Garrett said. "He'd like you to reconsider." "Tell him I'll think about it," Wesley said. Garrett looked at him with the smile of a man who knows more than he is saying. "He'd also like you to know that the road past his property is in need of maintenance, and that he may need to close it for repairs starting next week." The road to Crane's Crossing. The only road to Crane's Crossing that did not add 8 miles. Wesley watched Garrett ride away and stood in his yard for a long time after, listening to the evening settle around him, and thinking about what a man like Earl Cutter considered a social connection worth protecting. He rode into Crane's Crossing the next morning and told Louisa everything. She listened without interrupting, sitting straight in the chair in her small rooms with her hands folded on the table and her expression controlled and precise. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He is using me as leverage," she said, "not a question. He appears to be suggesting that he could," Wesley said. She looked at him steadily. "And what will you do?" "I have not decided," he said, and then, because she deserved honesty, "I am not going to give up the water rights." "I did not ask you to," she said. "I asked what you will do." "I am going to go to Tucson and push the Territorial Land Office to accelerate the claim filing and put it on formal record before Cutter can contest it," he said. "And I am going to ask the county sheriff to come out and look at the road situation." "The county sheriff is Sheriff Alderman," she said. "Mabel Cook told me he and Cutter went to school together." "Yes," Wesley said. "He did. I know Alderman. He is not a corrupt man, but he is a careful one. He will not act unless he has to." "Then we need to make sure he has to," Louisa said. He stared at her. "We," he said. She met his eyes without flinching. "Yes," she said. "We, unless you have an objection." He had approximately 40 objections, all of them located in the part of him that had spent 11 years avoiding giving the universe something to destroy. He sat with all of them for a moment and then said, "No, no objection." She nodded. "Good. Now tell me everything you know about the water rights laws in the territory." They spent 2 hours going through everything he knew, and she wrote notes in the clear, organized hand of a teacher. And when they were finished, she had a better structural understanding of the situation than he did, which he found he did not mind in the slightest. He rode to Tucson that afternoon. He was gone 3 days, pushing the land office hard, speaking to 2 different lawyers, and writing a careful letter to a territorial representative named Granger whom he had met once at a ranchers' meeting, and who had seemed like a man with an actual conscience. He returned to the ranch to find a note from Hector informing him that Cutter's men had ridden the fence line twice in the past 2 days, and a separate note, delivered via Tom Briggs, from Louisa. Her note said, "I have spoken to the other ranchers in the valley. The Morales family, the Hendersons, and old Mr. Crane himself have all had similar pressure from Cutter over the past 2 years. They are willing to speak to the territorial representative together if approached. Come to supper on Saturday and I will explain my thinking." He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket, which was not something he did with notes. Saturday's supper was at the Cook household, and Mabel Cook was the kind of woman who set a table that made people talk, and they talked about water rights and land law and Earl Cutter, with the focused energy of people who had been afraid of something for a long time and were ready to stop being afraid of it. By the time the pie came out, they had a plan, and the plan was solid, and Wesley looked across the table at Louisa, who was explaining the territorial filing process to old Mr. Crane with the patience and clarity of the excellent teacher she was, and felt something shift in his chest that was so large and so definitive that it required him to look at his pie for a moment to compose himself. After supper, walking back along the main street toward the livery where his horse was stabled, Louisa fell into step beside him in the easy way she had developed of walking with him, the way that did not require or demand anything but simply occupied the space he had. "You are good at this," he said. "At what?" she said. "At gathering people," he said. "At making them see that something is possible." She was quiet for a moment. "It is what teachers do," she said. "We convince people that the difficulty of something is not a reason to avoid it." They had stopped walking without deciding to, somewhere in the middle of the street where the moon was doing something to the dust that made everything silver and soft. He could hear horses in the livery and music from the saloon and the distant sound of the creek. "Louisa," he said. She looked up at him. He had a great many things he wanted to say, and they jammed together in the doorway of his composure, which had been a narrow doorway for a very long time. What came out was not any of the things he had been planning, which was probably for the best. "I am glad you came to the ranch," he said. "I know it was a coincidence and Clara arranging things without asking, but I am glad." She looked at him for a long moment, and her expression was the open, unguarded one that she had turned on him when she was leaving the ranch 3 weeks ago. "So am I," she said. He walked her to the cookhouse. They stood on the porch for a moment in the way of two people deciding something simultaneously. "Ride out on Sunday," he said. "The wild horses." "Yes," she said before he finished. "Yes." He walked back to the livery with considerably more warmth in his chest than was strictly warranted by the temperature, which was already 70 degrees and no excuse at all. The situation with Cutter deteriorated faster than Wesley had expected, which meant Cutter had less patience than Wesley had credited him with, or more urgency, which in either case was bad news. The road got closed on a Wednesday. Cutter's men put up a locked gate and a sign that said the road was under repair, and when Tom Briggs tried to ride through on his way to town for supplies, he was turned around at gunpoint by 2 men who were polite about it and completely inflexible. Wesley rode out to look at the gate himself and found Garrett on the other side of it, smoking a cigarette and looking pleased with himself. "Roads under repair," Garrett said. "How long?" Wesley said. Garrett shrugged. "These things take time." Wesley looked at the gate. He looked at the 2 men behind it who were carrying rifles, not just sidearms. He looked at Garrett. He turned his horse and rode home. He sent word to Louisa through the Henderson Ranch, which had access to a different road into town. The message was, "Road closed, I am fine. Push the letter to Granger if you can." Her reply came back the next day. "Letter sent 2 days ago. Morales and Crane are both writing separately." "What does Cutter actually want? Final answer," he wrote back. "The creek section, and possibly the whole eastern quarter once he has the water. This is about building a monopoly on water rights across the valley." Her reply, "Then this is not just about your ranch. Tell the other ranchers that, and come to town on Sunday by the long road. There is something you should hear." He came to town by the 8-mile route through the Henderson property on Sunday, which took an extra 2 hours each way, and found Louisa in her rooms with old Mr. Crane, and a man he had not expected to see, which was Deputy Marshal Tate from Tucson, a lean, quiet man in his 40s who had an excellent reputation for being thorough. Louisa had written to the marshal's office herself, directly, bypassing the county sheriff entirely. She had written a detailed, carefully organized account of the road closure, the water rights pressure, and the intimidation of multiple ranchers, and she had asked specifically for a deputy marshal rather than county law, correctly identifying that the territorial level was the one where Cutter's connections had least purchase. "Resourceful woman," Tate said, looking at Wesley with something that might have been amusement. Yes, Wesley said simply. Tate asked him a great many questions and wrote down everything with the thoroughness of a man who was building a case. He told them he could not act immediately without evidence of an explicit legal violation, but that the road closure was potentially actionable under territorial commerce laws if they could demonstrate it was coercive rather than genuine maintenance, and that if they could get 2 more ranchers on the record, he would be in a position to bring the matter before a territorial judge within the month. This was good news. It was also, as it turned out, the moment when things got worse, because Cutter had been watching. He had seen the deputy marshal ride into Crane's Crossing, and he had drawn the only conclusion available, and he was not a man who responded to the narrowing of his options with patience. Wesley did not find this out until Tuesday morning, when Hector came to the house at 6 in the morning, with the news that 2 of the southern fence sections had been torn down overnight, and 3 head of cattle had strayed through into the open territory, and someone had taken a shot at the fence post nearest the creek before leaving. It was a message, a clear, unambiguous message. Wesley spent most of Tuesday getting the fence repaired and the cattle back in, and he was short-tempered with it and worked until after dark, and he went to bed with the knowledge that Cutter was escalating and that the situation was moving faster than Deputy Marshal Tate's legal processes were likely to keep up with. Wednesday morning brought a different and more immediate problem. The messenger was a boy of about 12 from the Henderson Ranch, who arrived at a gallop and slid off his horse in the yard with the wild eyes of a child carrying news he does not fully understand. The message was from Mabel Cook. It said, "Miss Archer rode out toward your ranch this morning at first light on Henderson's lone horse. She said she had something important to tell you. She has not arrived, and it has been 4 hours, and Jim Henderson says he saw Cutter's men on the creek road at dawn." Wesley was already saddling his fastest horse before he finished reading it. He took the creek road at a hard gallop, leaning low over the horse's neck, with the morning sun cutting long and gold across the scrubland, and his heart doing something it had no business doing. He told himself she had simply taken a wrong turn, or the horse had thrown a shoe, or any of a dozen ordinary explanations. He told himself this with the complete confidence of a man who does not believe a word he is saying. He found her horse first, standing loose on the creek road about 2 miles from the Cutter property line, its reins dragging. He checked the horse quickly. No injury, no blood, just standing there with the calm stupidity of a horse that had been tied and gotten loose. That was a small relief. Somebody had been calm enough to tie the horse rather than just removing a person from it at speed. He followed the tracks, which were clear in the creek road dirt because it had rained 3 days before, and the tracks led off the main road and through a gap in the brush toward the south section of the Cutter property, toward the old stone building that had been a bunkhouse before Cutter converted it to a storage structure. He slowed his horse and came around the south side of the building the long way, through the brush, and came up to a window on the far side and looked through it, and saw Louisa Archer sitting on the floor with her wrists bound behind her back and a cut on her cheekbone that had not been there on Saturday, and Earl Cutter standing 6 feet away from her with a revolver and 2 men behind him. Wesley sat outside that window for 30 seconds and did the coldest, fastest thinking of his life. There were 3 of them inside that he could see. There might be more outside. He had 1 revolver and a rifle on his saddle. Cutter had Louisa as insurance. Going in through the door or window with guns out was how Louisa got shot. He needed to make Cutter want something more than he wanted to use Louisa as leverage, which meant Cutter needed to think he was getting what he wanted. Wesley rode around the building and came in through the front openly with his hands visible, leaving his rifle on the saddle. He knocked on the door of the old bunkhouse and said, "Earl, I know you're in there. I want to talk." There was a pause. Then Cutter said, "Doors open." Wesley walked in. He saw Louisa on the floor and something in his face must have done something because Cutter smiled. He saw the 2 men with rifles. He saw Garrett by the door behind him, which meant there were at least 4 total plus whoever was outside. Cutter said, "You went to the marshal's office." "The marshal's office is within my rights," Wesley said. "Your rights," Cutter said. "Interesting concept. You have a pretty schoolteacher who thought she could ride out to your ranch at dawn and got lost on my property." "What do you want, Earl?" Wesley said. "I want what I've always wanted," Cutter said. "The creek section, signed over, today." "And if I sign it over?" "The lady walks home," Cutter said. "The fence stays up. We have no further disputes." Wesley looked at the map Cutter spread on the old wooden table, the creek section marked in red, a transfer document beside it. He looked at Louisa. She was watching him with eyes that were steady and afraid and completely focused. "Let me talk to her first," Wesley said. Cutter looked amused. "You have 30 seconds. Wesley crossed the room and crouched in front of Louisa and said very quietly, "Are you hurt badly?" "No," she said. "The cheek is nothing. Wesley, do not sign that document." "If I sign it?" "If you sign it, he takes the water and the ranch follows within 2 years," she said, with the crisp clarity of someone who had been sitting there for 4 hours and had done the thinking available to her. "He will do the same to the Morales and the Hendersons and Crane. Do not sign it." "He has a gun pointed at you," Wesley said. "I am aware," she said. "Do not sign it." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, Cutter said, "Time's up, Haskins." Wesley stood up. He turned around. Cutter raised the revolver, not at him, at Louisa, the specific and particular cruelty of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. "Sign the document," Cutter said. Wesley looked at the document and looked at the gun and looked at Louisa, who met his eyes with an expression that was terrified and trusting simultaneously, and that simultaneous terror and trust did something to him that was beyond the capacity of any practical calculation. And then Louisa asked her question. Not a tactical question, not a practical question. A real question, a human question. The question she had apparently been sitting on for 6 weeks and chose this specific moment to ask, which either said everything about her courage or everything about her absolute refusal to let fear be the last thing in the room. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked, in the same quiet voice she used at supper tables and creek banks. Earl Cutter blinked. Even Garrett blinked. It was such a completely unexpected thing to say in the middle of a confrontation over land rights and weapons that it broke the rhythm of the room like a stone through ice. Wesley looked at her and felt 11 years of walls go down all at once. "Yes," he said. "Yes. I get lonely out here every single day." "Then we are going to survive this," Louisa said. "And after we do, you are going to tell me all about it." Cutter raised the revolver again and told them both to shut their mouths, and Wesley turned back to the room and took a breath and made a decision that was not about the creek section or the water rights or the ranch at all. "All right," he said. "All right, Earl, I'll sign it." He walked to the table. He looked at the document. He picked up the pen. He looked at the document for one more moment. And then he signed, not his name, but a long, clear line across the text itself, rendering the document legally void by defacement, which was something he knew about because the Tucson lawyer had mentioned it in passing as a protective measure. Cutter would not know that immediately. He would need to look at it carefully, and in the moment he looked at it, Wesley moved. He threw the table sideways, the heavy old wooden table, into Cutter and the man beside him, and he covered the distance to Louisa in 3 strides and got his hands on the ropes and had her on her feet and moving for the side door before Cutter got free of the table. Garrett went for his gun and Wesley hit him with his elbow in the jaw, not clean but effective enough, and then they were through the side door and into the sunlight. His horse was at the front of the building. They went for it at a run. There were shouts behind them and the crash of Cutter getting the table off himself, and then a gunshot that went wide and high, and Wesley had Louisa up on the horse and swung up behind her and kicked the horse hard, and they were moving before the second shot, through the brush and toward the creek road, riding hard and low. He heard pursuit. He pushed the horse harder, leaning around Louisa's back, her hair loose and flying against his face, her hands gripping the saddle horn, and he rode like he had learned to ride in Tennessee before the war, like the ground behind you was on fire and the only thing that mattered was forward. They were a mile out before the pursuit fell back. Cutter's men did not have the horses for a sustained chase, or perhaps Cutter was smart enough to know that Louisa Free made the situation worse for him, not better. They slowed to a canter and then a walk, and the sounds behind them faded into the creek sound and the wind. They rode for 10 minutes in silence. Wesley could feel Louisa shaking, not dramatically, but steadily, the fine trembling of a body releasing a very large amount of fear. "You defaced the document," she said, when they were far enough along the road to be safe. "Yes," he said. "You knew he would not look at it immediately." "I hoped." She was quiet. He was very aware that his arms were around her to hold the reins and that she was leaning against his chest, not by choice exactly, just by the position of things, but leaning nonetheless, and the warmth of it was extraordinary. "You said yes," she said. "What?" "When I asked if you get lonely," she said, "you said yes." "I know," he said. "You have never said that to anyone before, have you?" she said, again not a question. "No," he said. "Why did you say it then?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which she deserved. "Because you asked like it mattered," he said, "and because nothing else in the room mattered more than answering you honestly." She turned her head slightly, not enough to see his face, just enough to change the angle. He could see the line of her jaw and the cut on her cheekbone and the way her hair was moving in the wind off the mountains. "Wesley," she said. "Yes," he said. "When this is resolved," she said, "I would like to have a real conversation about loneliness, not a short one." "I would like that too," he said. They rode the rest of the way to the Henderson Ranch in a quiet that was different from any silence Wesley had occupied before. It was warm. It had something in it that he had spent 11 years convincing himself he did not need. Deputy Marshal Tate was still in Crane's Crossing. Wesley found him at the hotel within the hour and told him everything, including the assault, the firearm, the attempted coercion to sign over a land claim under duress, and the road closure. Tate listened with the focused attention of a man who now had exactly what he had needed. He rode for the Cutter property the next morning with 2 additional marshals he had wired for from Tucson, and a warrant signed by a territorial judge who had apparently been waiting for someone to give him grounds. Earl Cutter was arrested on Thursday, charged with unlawful imprisonment, assault, coercive land fraud, and interference with territorial commerce. 2 of his men, including Garrett, were charged separately. The remaining men scattered, which is what happens when the person holding the organization together is removed from it. The road was open by Friday. Wesley was at the marshal's office giving his formal statement when Tate mentioned, in the careful neutral tone of a man passing along relevant information, that the land claim on the creek section had been formally recorded on the previous Monday and was now a matter of public territorial record, and that the attempted coercion of the landholder after the formal recording of the claim constituted an additional criminal charge. The creek section was secure. He left the marshal's office and stood in the main street of Tucson in the thin afternoon light and felt the weight of the past week come off him in a single long exhalation. And then he felt something else, which was the absence of the weight, and what the absence revealed, which was the size of the thing he had been carrying for 11 years and had only just now begun to set down. He rode back to Crane's Crossing, arriving late, and went directly to the cookhouse. Mabel Cook opened the door and looked at his face and said, "She's in the sitting room," in the tone of a woman who already knows how this ends and approves. Louisa was sitting by the window in the lamplight with a book she was not reading, and when he came through the door she set the book down and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the open, unguarded one he had been seeing for weeks and finally knew the name of. He sat down across from her. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "I want to have that conversation," he said. "About loneliness," she said. "About loneliness," he said. "And about the fact that I have not been lonely since the morning I came home from the east pasture and found you sitting on my porch. I have not been lonely once since then, which is 11 years worth of a pattern broken in 6 weeks, and I believe you deserve to know that." Louisa was quiet for a moment. The lamplight was doing things to her expression that he was going to spend a great deal of time thinking about later. "I have not been lonely either," she said, which surprised me. "I have been alone since February of last year, and I thought I was used to it, and then I came to your ranch and met you and understood that I was not used to it at all. I had just stopped expecting anything different." He leaned forward in the chair. "Louisa," he said. "Wesley," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing. I recognize that my circumstances are not uncomplicated and that this ranch is not a comfortable life for everyone and that you have a position here that you have worked for and that matters to you. I am not asking you to give anything up. I am only asking if you would be willing to let me." "Yes," she said. "I have not finished asking," he said. "Wesley," she said, with the gentle patience of a teacher, "I have been waiting for you to ask since the Sunday you brought me out to see the wild horses. The answer is yes." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Since the horses," he said. "Since the horses," she confirmed. He smiled. It was a full one, not the small, careful, partial things he usually produced. It changed his face considerably, and from the way she was looking at him it appeared to be a welcome change. "Then since we are in agreement," he said, "would you like to take a walk? The evening is clear." She stood up and reached for her coat. "I would like that very much," she said. They walked the full length of Cranes Crossing's Main Street and back, and the conversation that had been building for 6 weeks finally opened up and ran like the creek in spring, clear and cold, and moving over everything. He told her about the loneliness in detail and fullness, not dramatizing it, just telling it true, the way it had felt to come home from the war to nothing, to build something out of work in silence, to convince himself the silence was enough. She told him about the year after her parents died, the strange grief of being the last of a family, the way she had decided to go west partly because she could not stand the weight of familiar places. They talked about their fathers, who sounded like similar men. They talked about books and about the territorial water laws and about the wild horses and about what the mountains looked like in the snow, which she had not yet seen, and he described at length, finding that he had been accumulating descriptions for years without anyone to give them to. When he left her at the cookhouse door, he took her hand and held it for a moment, just briefly, and she squeezed his fingers before letting go, and he walked to the livery to retrieve his horse with the feeling of a man who has walked out of 11 years of cold into something warm and particular and his. The courtship was, by the standards of 1878, a thorough one. He rode into Cranes Crossing 3 times a week, which was more than practical necessity had ever required. He brought her books when he found one she would like. She came to the ranch on Sundays when the weather permitted, and Hector, who took to her immediately and without reservation, began setting an extra place at the Sunday lunch table with the satisfaction of a man whose long-standing concern about his employer's mental health is being addressed. They took every walk available in both directions and some that required creating new ones. He taught her to ride properly, not the side-saddle accommodation she had been managing, but properly, and she was a quick learner with good instincts, as he had expected. She taught him, in return, a card game she had learned from her mother that was considerably more complicated than poker, and which he was terrible at, which she found satisfying. The schoolhouse opened in full in October, and he attended the first day along with every family in the valley, and watching her stand in front of the room with the ease and authority of someone doing the thing they were made to do filled him with a specific kind of pride that was new to him and entirely welcome. Earl Cutter's trial was held in Tucson in November. Wesley testified. So did Louisa, with the same clear, organized delivery she brought to everything, and the judge was visibly impressed. Cutter was convicted on 3 of 4 charges and sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. The road opened permanently. The water rights claim was upheld. The night after the verdict came through, Wesley came to the cookhouse with a bottle of good whiskey he had bought for the occasion, which was an extravagance but seemed appropriate. They sat with Mabel and her husband Tom and drank a toast to territorial justice and the effectiveness of well-organized paperwork. And then Mabel and Tom went to bed with the transparent excuse that they were tired, and Louisa and Wesley were left in the sitting room with the fire and the last of the whiskey and the warm quiet. He had been thinking about something for 2 months. He had been thinking about how to say it, which was more preparation than he usually applied to speech, and when the moment arrived it turned out to be simple after all. "I love you," he said. It was direct and plain, the way he said the things he meant. She looked at him for a moment with the expression that had been breaking down his walls since September. "I know," she said. "That is a very annoying thing to say," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I have known for some time. I was waiting for you to catch up." She paused. "I love you also, Wesley, very much. That is less annoying, I think." "Considerably less," he said. He crossed to the settee where she was sitting and sat beside her, close enough that, when she turned her face toward him, they were very near, and he kissed her for the first time in the lamplight with the fire going, and the whole settled weight of everything they had been through together, making it the most naturally arrived-at moment he had experienced in his life. She kissed him back without hesitation, which was exactly as it should have been. He proposed on a Sunday morning in December, at the river where the cottonwoods had dropped their leaves, and the water was running cold and clear, and the mountains beyond were showing their first snow, exactly as he had promised to show her. He had a ring that had been his mother's, which Clara had sent West years ago, with a note saying she held it for safekeeping, and that he would know when to use it. He had not made a speech. He had simply asked, straightforwardly, and she had said yes with the same simplicity, and they had stood in the winter morning by the cold creek looking at each other with the particular expressions of two people who have stopped waiting for something. They married in March of 1879, in the church in Crane's Crossing, with every family in the valley present and Mabel Cook crying with the satisfaction of someone who has personally observed a love story unfold. Hector stood with Wesley and gave a toast at the small celebration after that was short and genuine, and made several people cry, including Louisa, and almost including Wesley, who managed to confine it to a brightness in his eyes that he was choosing to attribute to the spring wind. She kept teaching. She loved it, and Wesley had meant it when he said he was not asking her to give anything up. The school had 40 children by spring, and she was the most important fixture in the valley's future, and he would have been a fool to want anything else for her. She rode to school 4 days a week, and Wesley met her on the road on the return when he could. On the days the school ran late and the weather was uncertain, he waited outside with 2 horses and a lantern, which became so consistent that the children began to call him Miss Lewis's lantern man, which he did not mind. The east pasture expanded in April, with the creek section finally free of dispute, and by summer the ranch had grown to 900 head, the most it had ever held. Hector's family moved from Nogales to a small house on the property edge, and the Briggs brothers were joined by 2 additional hands, and the place began to have the feeling of something alive rather than merely operational. On an evening in late June, Wesley and Louisa sat on the porch of the main house in the warm dark after supper, which was the thing they did most evenings when the work allowed, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the last colors go off the mountains in the west, and he was so completely and quietly happy that the contrast with 11 years before was almost physical. "Tell me something," Louisa said. "What?" "That day," she said, "in the bunkhouse. When I asked if you were lonely." She paused. "I have been wondering, did you know I was going to ask something real? Was that part of a plan?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I had no idea what you were going to say. I was calculating distances to the door." She laughed softly. "I did not plan it either," she said. I had been thinking about it for weeks, about whether I would ask you, and then I was there and Cutter was pointing a gun at you, and it seemed like the only thing in the room that actually mattered." He turned his head to look at her. "Why that question?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Because I knew you would answer honestly," she said. "I had seen you answer honestly about everything else that mattered, even when it cost you. And I thought that if you could be honest in that moment, then there was a way through it, because honest men find their way through things." She paused. "And because I needed to know, for me, I needed to know if you were as lonely as I was." He pulled her closer. She settled against him. "Were you?" he said. "Lonely. Every day," she said. "Until the day I arrived on your porch and you came back from the east pasture and looked at me like I was something you could not quite account for." "You were," he said. "You very much were." She turned and kissed him, warm and long, in the full dark of the porch, with the mountains invisible beyond, and the stars coming out one by one above them. And he held her like a man holding something he had been given that he could not fully believe was his. In October of 1879, Louisa told him she was pregnant, sitting at the breakfast table with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes nervous in the way that was unlike her. And he felt the news land in his chest like light landing on something that had been dark for a very long time. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, and told her that this was the best morning he had had in his recallable life, which was not a thing he said lightly. And she smiled at him with the trembling, brilliant smile of a woman who had not been sure of the reception. Their son was born in June of 1880, a Sunday morning in the room that had been a spare room and was now a nursery, with the sun coming through the window and the doctor from Crane's Crossing and Mabel Cook both in attendance. He was large and healthy and loudly unhappy about his arrival, which Wesley understood. He held his son for the first time with a carefulness that had nothing to do with uncertainty and everything to do with the extraordinary weight of something precious, and looked across the room at Louisa in the bed, exhausted and luminous, looking back at him. "James," she said. "I would like to call him James, for your father." Wesley's father had been named James. He had never told her that. He looked at her with the brightness in his eyes that was no longer anything to do with wind. "Yes," he said. "James." Young James Haskins was, by the assessment of everyone on the ranch, the loudest and most energetic child in the territory, which Hector's wife Rosa said was a sign of strong character, and which the Briggs brothers found hilarious. He had Wesley's dark hair and Louisa's brown eyes and her directness, which manifested itself from the age of about 14 months, as the habit of pointing at things he wanted with a finger, and an expression that brooked no misunderstanding, which Wesley found both familiar and deeply funny. Clara came to visit in the spring of 1881, arriving from St. Louis with 3 trunks and the demeanor of a woman who has been waiting to be proven right. She spent 2 weeks at the ranch, most of them in competition with young James for Louisa's attention, and on the last evening she sat on the porch with Wesley after the others had gone in and told him she was glad. "I can see it," Clara said. "The way you look the way you looked before the war." He thought about that. "Better than that," he said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "Better than that." She left the following morning, and he stood in the yard watching the wagon go, with James on his hip and Louisa beside him with her hand in his, and he thought that his sister had done the one thing in her life he was entirely grateful for, which was sending him a woman with a carpet bag and the patience to ask the right question at the right moment. The school in Crane's Crossing continued to grow. By 1882, there were 60 children enrolled, and Louisa had a second teacher, a young woman named Clara Ann who had come from New Mexico on Louisa's recommendation, because Louisa was now the person the school board wrote to when they needed teachers, which she took seriously and managed with characteristic competence. She had written a letter to the Territorial Education Office in 1881 about funding and standards that had circulated to 3 other counties and generated a visit from a territorial official who wanted to discuss expanding the model. She was building something, the same way he had built something. He had watched it happen with the specific admiration of a man who recognizes in another person the quality he most respects. In November of 1882, she told him she was pregnant again. He kissed her and said wonderful and meant it fully, and this time neither of them was nervous, only glad. Their daughter was born in July of 1883, on the hottest day of a hot summer, and she was named Margaret Ruth. Margaret for Louisa's mother and Ruth for nobody in particular, except that it was a name they both liked the sound of. Where James was loud and relentless, Margaret was quiet and observant, watching the world from the very beginning with an expression of focused consideration that, Wesley told Louisa, looked exactly like her mother. Louisa said she thought it looked like him. They agreed it was flattering either way. James, at 3 years old, examined his new sister with the thoroughness of a rancher inspecting new livestock, and then announced that she was acceptable, and climbed into the chair beside the bed, and told Louisa a long story about something that had happened in the barn that morning involving General the old dog's puppy, which had been born in March, and which James had named Sergeant with a seriousness that had made every adult on the ranch laugh for 3 days. General had died the previous winter, at a good old age for a dog, and Wesley had buried him in the south pasture under the cottonwood tree. It had been sadder than he expected, losing that old dog, because General was the one living thing that had been with him since the beginning, since the lonely early years when the ranch had been just him and the cattle and the silence. He had sat at the grave for a while and Louisa had sat beside him without speaking, and after a time she had taken his hand, and it had been enough. The replacement puppy, christened Sergeant by James, was nothing like General in temperament and everything like him in loyalty, and the ranch had adjusted. In 1883, the Southern Pacific Railroad completed its line through the southern Arizona Territory, which changed the economics of cattle ranching faster than anyone had predicted. Wesley spent 2 months reading everything he could find about the railroad cattle shipment process, and then made a trip to Tucson to talk to the Southern Pacific agent, and came home with a contract that tripled the practical market for the Haskins herd and reduced the cost of getting them there by about 60%. He told Louisa all of it over supper, the numbers and the logistics and what it meant for the next 5 years, and she listened with the full focused attention she always brought to things that mattered to him and asked the right questions, and when they had talked it through she said, "You should bring Hector into this conversation. He understands the cattle end better than you give him credit for." He did, and she was right, as she generally was, and Hector had 3 ideas that improved the plan considerably. On the evening of their 5th anniversary in March of 1884, they rode out to the river section in the late afternoon, just the 2 of them, and sat on the rock at the river's edge where she had taken off her boots the first summer and laughed at the cold water. The cottonwoods were coming into their spring green, that particular pale gold green that only lasted 2 weeks and was worth coming out to see. 5 years, Louisa said. Yes, Wesley said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Do you know what I thought the morning I was riding out here and Cutter's men stopped me on the road? What? He said. I thought I have to get to the ranch because I need to tell him something, she said. And the thing I needed to tell him was that I love him. I had not told you yet. You had told me, but I had said I know, which was not the same thing, and I had decided on the ride out that I was going to say it properly. He looked at her. I had been rehearsing it, she said. On the horse. And then Cutter's men came out of the brush and I thought, I have not told Wesley I love him and now this. She laughed softly. So I sat in that bunkhouse for 4 hours, thinking about how annoyed I was going to be if I did not get to say it. And then you came through the door and I looked at your face and I thought, he is going to get us out of this. You asked me about loneliness, he said. I needed you to be honest, she said. If you were honest about that, you would be honest about everything else, and honest men make good decisions. He shook his head slowly. You are a remarkable woman, he said. You keep saying that, she said, and the warmth in her voice was enormous. I keep finding it to be true, he said. She leaned against him in the spring afternoon beside the cold creek, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the water run over the stones in the particular light of the Arizona spring. And he was so far from lonely that the word no longer applied to the same life. That evening they had supper with the whole ranch, because that was what they did now on anniversary evenings, a tradition Hector had started the second year by simply appearing at the main house with his wife Rosa and their 4 children and a roasted chicken, and announcing that they were celebrating. The Briggs brothers had come, and the newer hands, and Mabel Cook and her husband had ridden out from town, and it had become a yearly event, that supper, with more people and more noise and more food each year. James sat between Hector's oldest boy and Sergeant the dog and ate everything within reach. Margaret sat on Louisa's lap for the early part of the evening, and then transferred to Wesley's lap, and fell asleep there with the complete trust of a small person who has never had any reason to doubt the safety of a given situation. And he sat with her weight against his chest, and watched the table full of people who were his, who were genuinely, truly his. And thought about the morning 11 years ago when he had stood in a sold field in Tennessee and understood that there was no longer anything to go back to. He had been right about that. There had been nothing to go back to. Everything worth having was forward. In 1885, Louisa expanded the school program to include adult literacy classes 2 evenings a week, which drew ranch hands, recent arrivals, and older residents who had never had access to schooling. She ran them herself on Monday and Wednesday evenings, and Wesley collected her at 9 o'clock on those nights and rode back with her under the stars. And those rides became some of his favorite hours of the week, because she talked about her students with such particular care, the small advances and the stubborn difficulties, and the moments when someone understood something new, that it was like being inside the best part of her, the part that wanted the world to be better and went about making it so. She told him once, on one of those rides, that she thought teaching was the most important work available, not because of what it built immediately, but because of what it made possible in the 20 years following. He thought about that for a long time and then said he agreed, and meant it, and was aware that he was married to someone who was making the territory genuinely better, quietly and without requiring acknowledgement, which was the best kind of better. They had one more child, a second son named Thomas, born in January of 1887, who arrived in the middle of a cold snap with all the impatience of a person who has not been consulted about the timing and considers it irrelevant. Thomas was from the beginning a calm, deliberate child who watched things before engaging with them, and when he made a decision committed to it absolutely, and who at 8 months old had the focused, considering look of the kind of person who was going to be quietly correct about things for the rest of his life. James greeted his new brother with the proprietary enthusiasm he brought to everything, and Margaret, 4 years old and in possession of opinions, examined him with the same thoroughness she brought to all new developments and announced that he had nice hands, which was not a thing Wesley would have thought to notice but which, on examination, proved accurate. 3 children. A school, 950 head of cattle and growing. A creek section with clean water and a legal title that had been tested and upheld. A foreman with a family settled on the property, working partners of long standing. A ranch community that had grown from one solitary man in an empty house to something that had names and lives and futures running through it. And Louisa, who was the center of it and the beginning of it, who had arrived with a carpet bag and her father's courage and a question she had been waiting to ask for 6 weeks, and who had asked it at the exact moment when the answer could not be anything but true. He told her this one evening, the summer of 1887, sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, with the warm dark around them and the stars running thick and white above the mountains. "I think about what would have happened if Clara had not written that letter," he said. "If you had not come to the ranch. I would have been on the stagecoach to Crane's Crossing," she said. "I would have passed your gate and never known you were there. And I would have gone on like I was, he said, for years more. I was good at it, I did not even know what I was missing. She turned to look at him in the low light. What were you missing? He looked at the dark mountains. He looked at the house behind them where their children were sleeping and the lamp in the kitchen was burning. He looked at her face. Everything, he said, just about everything. She reached for his hand and held it. He held hers back. Do you know what I know? She said. What? That you have not been lonely, she said, in 9 years. He thought about that. It was true. Not one morning since the day she arrived had he woken to that particular hollow quiet that had been his entire interior life for 11 years before it. Not once. No, he said. Not once. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The mountains went on in the dark, patient and old, and the creek ran in the distance, and somewhere in the south pasture the cattle were quiet, and above the house the stars were doing what they always did, which was being there regardless of what happened below them, indifferent and brilliant. But down here under the stars on this porch, with the lamp burning in the kitchen and his children asleep and this woman against his side, nothing was indifferent. Everything was specific and warm and named, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full to the edges with every word they had said, and every mile they had ridden, and every evening they had sat together watching the mountains go dark, and it was the furthest thing in the world from lonely. The next morning Wesley rose before dawn, as he always did, and stood in the kitchen making coffee, while the sky outside the window went from black to gray to the first pale gold of a new day. Louisa came in 20 minutes later with her hair loose, and she poured her own coffee and stood beside him at the window, and they watched the light come in together. James could be heard from his room debating something with Sargent, who was not a dog that debated but tolerated the practice. Margaret was still asleep. Thomas made the small exploratory sounds of a baby deciding whether it was worth waking up. Louisa said, "What is the plan today?" he told her. East pasture inspection in the morning, the creek check in the afternoon, and Tom Briggs had a question about the southern fence he needed to look at before the end of the week. She told him she had her adult literacy class that evening and needed him to start supper without her, which he could do, the cornbread in particular. They stood at the window and the day came in around them, warm and full and theirs. He had been 29 years old and solitary and sealed when she walked through the gate. He was 38 now, and the man who had been sealed was so thoroughly open that he could barely remember the particular quality of that closed-off life, except as a shadow to measure this light against. "Louisa," he said. "Yes," she said, without looking up from her coffee. "Thank you for asking," he said. She looked up at him then. She knew immediately what he meant. He could see it in her face. "Thank you for answering," she said. He kissed her forehead. She put her free hand against his chest. Outside, the Arizona morning opened up in all its colors, gold and rose and the deep particular blue that came before full daylight, spreading out over the mountains and the grass and the creek and the ranch that was no longer just his in the old solitary way, but theirs, in the only way that mattered. The loneliness was gone. It had been gone for 9 years, answered and replaced by something so permanent and warm and particular that it had become the ground under his feet, the way the ranch and the mountains and the creek were the ground, foundational and unmoving, and simply, beautifully there. He held his coffee and held his wife's hand and listened to his children waking up, and outside the window the day expanded into everything that was possible, and none of it, not one single moment of it, was lonely anymore.